The story I'm about to tell you requires a bit of context. My family was made up of 4 people: my mom, my dad, and my older brother, who was born 2 years prior. We lived in a quiet town in the UK. I won't mention which one due to legal reasons, where I assumed I'd be living my entire life. Home life was perfectly fine. My parents both had jobs, but not the kinds that kept them out for days, or were they neglectful or overbearing. My brother Simon was not a bully. He wasn't mean or rude or arrogant. In fact, in time, he would become my best friend, always being there for me when I needed him, or giving me space when I didn't. I tell you this now to show you that outside of what I'm about to say here, my life was once perfectly normal. There was no trauma, no constant tears, no fighting. My family were happy, and so was I. But then I was 5, and it was the day that I saw it for the first time that things stopped being normal. I was laying in bed, sleeping peacefully, when I heard something beyond the window. My bedroom was on the 2nd floor of my family home, tucked away in the back of the house to overlook the garden from a large window. That night, the blinds hadn't been pulled, giving me a full look at the shadowscape of the midnight beyond the glass. That night, for the first time, I saw the face of the creature who watched over me. I remember in vivid detail. Even in the dark, my eyes spared no expense, registered every detail. The head was wide enough that the ears, where they should have been, were hanging off either side of the visible space. The skin was the same shade as the rest of the night, an ebony charcoalish hue, with the texture between worn leather and tree bark. They had no nose, just 2 deep slits that flared in and out. The mouth hung agape, large sharp teeth sitting 3 rows along gums, some broken, most yellowed from lack of attention. But it was the eyes that still scarred me to think about. Giant bulbous eyes, like the bulbs of street lamps, glossy and white, illuminating the dark, pupilless and milky. Clear veins ran from the corners, bloodshot and thumping. The hair of the monster billowing in the wind like branches of a tree, exploding from the back of its head with reckless abandon. I was petrified of it. My window was closed, and even then, I could hear it breathe. Those heavy, ragged breaths blowing thick condensation onto the only protection between me and the giant's grasp. I spent the entire night watching it in utter terror, curled tightly in my blankets as a self-defense shield, though I knew even the impenetrable might of the covers couldn't stop whatever that thing was. I remember the first speck of light, the being suddenly shifting, uncomfortable as I thought the sun hurt its body. It lumbered away, moving silently despite the massive form, vanishing to the tree line as it stepped over the garage in one giant stretch. The next morning, I could barely stay awake as I looked into my bowl of sugary cereal, trying to determine what I had seen, if what I had seen was even real. My father must have clocked that I wasn't feeling alright, so he approached me with a question I knew he'd ask. "How'd you sleep?" I mentioned in retort I hadn't, and explained why. I mentioned the giant monster that had watched me, explaining how it stood outside my window all night until the sun came up. I'd expected him to give me the usual spiel of, "You were having a nightmare," or the "it wasn't real," perhaps even reprimand me in the form of, "Why didn't you come get us?" out of parental concern. However, what they instead told me was far more unnerving than if they'd blown it off. What they said was simply, "The Sentinel? Yeah, he's been around. Did he scare you?" I look up from my bowl, my tiny child mind trying to make sense of what had just been said. Even at my age, when your parents are confirming something you felt, you knew was like being watched with the highest honor, it felt as though they had just told me something they should not have. And yet, here they were, spilling everything about what had been outside my window, though to them it seemed that was a who in my parents. My parents sat me down, explaining that during the night, a very large gentleman by the name of the Sentinel came to someone's house and watched them while they slept. Though it wasn't picky, it would often choose someone with their blinds pulled up, hence why I had been the unlucky participant in this visitation. And to the best of their knowledge, that was all it did. It just watched people. It seemed enjoying so. So they never investigated any further. I couldn't believe my ears. I wasn't sure what to believe. That my parents were telling me the truth, or this was some sort of disturbing lie to get me to stop being afraid of my nightmares. The very same day, I was playing in the sandpit at the preschool, trying to stay awake when I decided to bring it up with my friends. I told them about what I had seen and hoped they would be able to tell me something else. We were all 5. It would be so easy for a group of like-minded individuals to come up with a solution to a problem that may not have even existed. And yet, I received an answer that, yet again, caused me to debate everything I'd ever known. You saw him too? The Sentinel, as it turns out, wasn't just at our home issue. So, some of my friends even had seen it too, and in some cases earlier in life than I had. When they confronted their parents about it, they'd all received the exact same explanation that my parents had given me, and told not to worry about it. My final step was to ask the only other person I knew would tell me the absolute truth, and that was the teacher. I hurried over, pulling on her skirt to get her attention before asking her if she'd ever heard of the Sentinel. And like the others, she was able to recall information about the giant that I had never seen before last night. She crouched down, telling me about how the Sentinel protected those it watched over and prevents them from getting hurt during the night. If the Sentinel showed up at my window then I was a very lucky boy. I didn't feel lucky. I felt lied to, in all honesty. However, unless the entire town decided to come together and gaslight me about this in some elaborate plan to get me to sleep better, the years began to rush by as I started to come to terms with the creature outside my window. My parents began to pull the blinds every night past the point where further adding to my suspicion about how real the Sentinel actually was. But I never stopped thinking about him. At the age of 7, when I started to get into a bedtime rhythm of my own, I decided one night to test the information provided to me earlier in life. I left the blinds open, sitting on my bed, and watching outside of the window, ready to spy on whoever came up to it. I must have waited for hours on end as I studied the window, every tiny shift of movement out in the garden alerting me like I was a sniper on the watch for the enemy. Eventually, though, my body gave in. I was going under. Sleep had me in its clutches, and I was trying to force my eyes. I was trying to force my eyes shut. And then, in a single long blink, the Sentinel had been summoned. They looked just as disturbing as the last time. A horrible shadow monster, with wild hair, bloodshot eyes, giant snoring breaths as it watched me. It stared at me, unblinking, trying to study me with its hollow, pupilless orbs. The mouth hung open just enough so I could see the teeth once more, somehow even worse looking than before. It was then I would make the worst decision of my entire life. Slipping out of bed, I approached the window quietly and slowly as I could, like I was approaching a deer in the forest. The eyes followed me, ever still. Curious what I appeared to be doing, I got a closer look to the window, stopping just shy of the windowsill as I looked up at the enormous face. From a distance, I could smell it. The smell of dead fish mixed with rotting leaves, it made me sick to my stomach. The Sentinel did something very strange. Almost comically, it began to stick its tongue out. This large dinner plate width tongue, and licked my window with the sound of a fork on ceramic. It left behind a smear of thick, gooey saliva. Little flecks of whatever its last meal was upon the glass began to drizzle down in chunks onto the outside. It then did this 3 more times, each leaving behind more phlegmy, bubbling spit until it seemed to realize I wasn't going to respond to this action. And to my surprise, it lumbered away, leaving the same way it had in the sun 2 years ago. I kept watch of it this time. Instead of going into the forest, it took a right, walking over to a neighboring house, within the view and beginning to look into the window. It had taken 2 years, but I now believe what my parents told me. The very next day, I tried to show them what the Sentinel had done to my window, but they laughed it off. "You must have been happy to see you," they told me. It didn't matter. When I came home from school that day, the window had been cleared off of any bodily fluids. They must have had someone come over and get rid of it. That wouldn't be my last interaction with the Sentinel. Hell, this wouldn't even be my last interaction with it that very same year. My curiosity got the better of me one late night in December, and I ended up leaving the blinds open once more, waiting for it to return. It took the bait almost immediately. One power nap later, the Sentinel had returned, standing outside of my window with the same glassy-eyed gaze. The problem was, even though I had invited it to watch over me, I never actually intended to let it stay, and so another sleepless night overtook me. Christmas Eve, that very same year, I witnessed something I hadn't seen my parents done before. They took a wrapped present and placed it on the back doorstep, locking the door behind them. They must have seen me watching because they had an exploration at the ready. "We're giving the Sentinel a thank you present. Santa doesn't deliver to him, so we do it instead." I thought it was ridiculous. More fool me, because the next day the present was gone, the only remains of it being the ribbon my mother had tied with it. Interactions between me and the Sentinel started to become closer together as I became more and more obsessed with it. Now that my fear of the Sentinel was out the window, I was growing more confident in what I did. The blinds stayed open for more nights in a row, and I thought it always came to see me. I never had to worry about it being gone for too long. It wasn't like it was just visiting me either. Other people were still seeing it too. My friends were always ready to talk about how they saw it just before they fell asleep, or how someone else would eventually have their first interaction with the beast, excitedly sharing the information with everyone else. Drawings began to litter the sketchbook, then my walls, drawings of the Sentinel looking through my window, or through my neighbors as I tried to draw what I imagined I was seeing in the pitch black. I tried to draw him without the darkness surrounding him. Drawings of it if he was just a normal-looking human or some sort of tree monster. Maybe a giant, snaking beast. I drew his eyes and his mouth and the lack of a nose. I drew the hair, both as heavy strands of unkept mess and little tiny hands grabbing at the air with small, gnarled fingers. I even drew him with what I imagined to be his hair down in a mullet and in an afro. I was making light of the monster beyond my glass. Unfortunately, my obsession began to lead to some less favorable side effects. At the age of 12, after my parents found me passed out in the middle of the kitchen, I woke up in a hospital. Doctors had an official diagnosis for me the same day I was released. Insomnia is a hell of a thing. I'd go days at a time without getting a wink of sleep, but that was fine. It just gave me more time to study the Sentinel. It was like I was tracking a wild animal. Sentinel was my case study, and I was taking the information down about it at a speed unrivaled. For my birthday, I asked for a diary, not to write my feelings away, but to keep track of the Sentinel, both through personal encounters and interactions of others. Something that, to my surprise, people were starting to fall out of favor talking about. Sure, when I asked them, they would tell me about how they maybe saw it a few nights ago, or my friend told me about this one time, but it seemed like they were starting to just grow accustomed to the massive, hulking monstrosity that visited them off and on. My parents, too, were growing concerned with my obsession. I'm not sure why. My studies were still as good as ever, and I was still doing good in school. Sure, maybe I passed out in class a few times. Maybe they'd find me in a position which would imply I spent the entire night writing about the Sentinel and things it had done. Maybe the bags under my eyes were getting too deep and the sleeping pills hadn't worked in a while, but I wasn't worried. My insomnia wasn't a condition. It was assisting me getting more information on the Sentinel. I was 13 when it finally happened. I had to come home that day after school, another day of trudging through 7 hours of hell to a parking lot of police cars. At first I assumed someone had been arrested, but when I found that it was outside of my house, I realized something was very wrong. My mother was in shambles. My father, too upset to speak. I had to get the information from the officer who told me the basic information of what was wrong. Any additional information came from my mother during the same night in a drunken stupor. Simon and my mom had gotten into an argument the previous night. Simon had never been a bad kid, but that night he'd wanted to go out with his friends and go see a movie on its opening day. Naturally, my mother had disagreed, not only due to the fact it was a school night, but due to the curfew in place. They'd not gotten into a yelling match. He'd stormed up to his room, and Mom had tried to give him some space. The next day, Simon wasn't in his room. The only evidence to where he was an open window and a note saying he was going to the movies, and he would take whatever punishment came to him when he came back. Simon never came back. Not that day, not the following night. 3 days passed before any form of search and rescue began. All we had was a vague idea of where he'd gone to, who he was with, and what he'd done. Dad went out every day, searching for him. The forest in our backyard was vast and expansive, and it covered miles between here and the next city over. No one could have gone missing that long without showing any signs of evidence towards where they might have vanished. It would take me a while before I recognized a certain pattern in my father's search. He'd go out in the early morning, mostly when I was still asleep, and begin his trek wherever he felt that Simon could have ended up. For the next 10 or so hours, we wouldn't see him again, only for him to return almost at 7 on the dot, without Simon and soon without hope. I didn't understand why. After all, if people searched at night, then it would come up with some other clue. I don't know when my father finally gave up, because the date didn't seem to matter past a certain point. The day of Simon's disappearance and what constituted as today became the same time. Each day, I'd get false flash of relief, thinking that Simon would be in his bed, only to be met with the same toppling realization that he was still gone. But it was one of those many nights, as I was laying in bed, tears in place of sleep, Sentinel returned to my window. On the very same night, I learned the truth about my brother's disappearance. The Sentinel was different this time. The terrifying atmosphere had returned, something I hadn't felt since I was 5 years old. As I was slipping out of bed, approaching my window meekly, I felt the pit of my stomach begin to build, soon heavy enough to root me in place. The eyes stared down at me. Absent in nature, gaping mouth had twisted up into a satisfied grin, like a toddler had been given his favorite meal. The front rows of teeth matted with a shining scarlet, like he had done so many years before. He licked the glass, this time leaving a bloody smear along it, complete with chunks of hair and muscle. It would take an idiot not to figure out whose blood that belonged to. What was more difficult to figure out was which of his friend's blood it was mixed with. The next day, I screamed my lungs out at anyone who'd listen. I pointed to my window, still filthy with the trauma-inducing smear. That painted glass on the second story of our home, trying to get them to see what the Sentinel had done. Police, firefighters, teachers, parents, children. I showed them what their precious Sentinel had done to my brother, and the friend's brother had known since he was 5. I had expected a riot, maybe some sort of campaign to take down the beast that lived on my neighborhood's doorstep. A bristle of empathy towards the situation they thought they'd gone through. What I instead received was a look of pity, and my parents grounding me for spreading lies. In an instant, the town shifted into silence. Just 24 hours before, parents were crying out for their children, begging authorities to bring them back safe, or at least in one piece so they could bury them with dignity. The same day, I let everyone know, and everyone in town know the truth. Those same parents were shunning me like a cancer on their lives. Like I hadn't exposed anything to them. It didn't hit me until later that night, sitting alone in my bedroom and looking through the scrawny drawings of the Sentinel that covered my room, that it really did come crashing in on me. How dare they? I'd told them the truth. I told them who'd done it. I told them who was responsible, and they pretended they hadn't heard me. Why was the Sentinel being protected, even when they knew that he was the one who had taken lives of people they cared about? Over the coming days, the town progressed into a hushed whisper. Coincidentally, the very next day, I told them this truth. Did they find the bodies of the 5 who died? Though bodies was a gross overstatement. They barely found enough of each to make up a single full human. A bloody smoothie of guts and organs, of skulls and ribs. Anything the Sentinel hadn't wanted to digest or hadn't used to pick his teeth. They covered that up too. The news reported on it. Whoever had been forced to tell them such an egregious lie had been chosen to go with the even more unlikely story that it had been some random psycho from the next town over, having escaped from a halfway house the same night, kidnapped the kids to hurt them in such a gruesome way. They didn't explain how the bodies were found near a hotspot of "do not enter" signs, or how the only hint that they had ever had that the bodies were there was a bloody trail leading into the mouth of an opening mining cave. To them, it had been some fun exploration where they'd meet an unfortunate end. How cruel it was the same halfway house just so happened to have a patient go missing. How confusing it happened to be a patient who seemed to have just gotten well enough to be released too, as if they'd been willingly released back into the wild. The town wanted this. The people wanted this. To pull the wool over the eyes of whoever was looking in, not due to the story being insane, just because they didn't believe the monster they'd grown up around would ever hurt them. I tried to remain angry with what the Sentinel had done. I tried so hard to make the bad guy in the story to make my brother-eating monster the one who deserved the hate. But the more I was left to my own devices, my growing up, my evidence of who he really was, it was like a switch being forced into the middle of on and off. The Sentinel wasn't some smart, chaotic manipulator. It wasn't a puppeteer or a king in some greater scheme, to my knowledge. It wasn't even actively trying to do anything that would anger or upset me. The Sentinel was just some wild animal roaming around the neighborhood like any other deer or raccoon as it scrounged for its next meal. The people who allowed such a thing, nay, encouraged it, they were the ones who were wrong in my eyes. Things fell apart soon after, no longer being able to trust my parents like I had originally thought I was capable of doing. I soon moved out of my own accord, heading across the country just so I'd never have to stay in contact with them. I still received the occasional letter from one of them asking me if I would be willing to come back to the town someday to patch things up or just to talk it out. Frankly, I've never been happier now that I've gotten away. My insomnia has improved, perhaps thanks to the constant fear of being watched while I slept having been removed from the equation. I soon settled down with my own family, a wife that I'm lucky to have ever met, 2 children that I would give my world for, a stable job, a stable household away from the terror that had been brought in those painful memories of my life. Some nights, though, I still get those nightmares, those moments where my eyes pry open in the middle of the night, and the moon is in just the right position to look like an eyeball staring at me through the blinds, the smell of rotting flesh lingering in the air, a shadow too wavy to be a branch in my subconscious. There's always still a moment where I think, just for a second, the Sentinel has moved on and has come to find me, so it may watch me for that little while longer. I pray to God, whichever one might be watching, that the Sentinel is happy where it is. I doubt any predator is as spoiled for its choice as the one who was invited to eat from the mistakes of the living.